عليه السلام. أهلا وسهلا. بارك فيك. حبيبي الله يحفظك. شكرا حبيبي. Thank you. Appreciate it. Ready? طيب السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الأمين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. أما بعد. First of all, Ramadan Mubarak to those of you that I haven't seen. And Jazakumullahu khairan for your enthusiasm to learn the biography of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal rahimahullah. We're going to take the biography of this Imam specifically, and inshallah, whenever Allah permits at later dates, we'll look at the lives of all the other Imams inshallah. But specifically the life of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. Because the scholars and the historians say there were two stances in Islamic history that were the most important stances. And that is, the first is that of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu on the day of Ridda, when the majority of the Arabian Peninsula apostatized. And Ahmad ibn Hanbal in the mihna of the creation of the Quran. But you might ask yourself, there were many dangerous situations in Islamic history. Yani the Tatar, for example, they killed millions, plural, millions of Muslims, destroyed cities, destroyed many great books. And you know, they threw all the books from the libraries in Baghdad into the Euphrates River until the river became black as it washed out the ink from these books. You'll hear that Imam al-Shafi'i wrote this many books, this Imam wrote that many books, but we only have one or two. Why? They were destroyed by the Mongols. So why didn't the scholars say the Mongols, this time was one of the most dangerous times for Islam? The scholars explain that with the stance of Abu Bakr and the stance of Ahmad ibn Hanbal, Islam itself was under the threat of being changed. As for the Mongols, they threatened the Muslims, they killed a lot of Muslims, but Islam itself wasn't under the threat of being changed. So the scholars say, had it not been for the stance of Abu Bakr, we would have received Islam today with no zakah. And had it not been for the stance of Ahmad ibn Hanbal rahimahullah, we would have received an Islam where the Quran is not the speech of Allah and the Quran was created. And bi'idhnillah, I hope that you will appreciate the stance of the Imam as we look into it, and you'll see that at some point he was the only one, or one of the few, or the main one who was standing against this fitna. So our Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal rahimahullah, he was born in the month of Rabi' al-Awwal in the year 164 after the Hijrah. 164 after the Hijrah. The first of our Imams was Imam Abu Hanifa, and he was born in the year 80 after the Hijrah. Imam Malik 96 after the Hijrah. So now you get an idea, and this is the last one as far as chronology, was Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, born in the year 164 after the Hijrah. And his name was Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Hanbal ibn Hilal ibn Asad ibn Idris ibn Abdullah. And he was born in the city of Baghdad in Iraq. And he said, I have never seen my grandfather, nor my father. So he was orphaned at birth. He never saw his father, never saw his grandfather. Now notice, his name is Ahmad, the son of Muhammad, the son of Hanbal. But people call him Ahmad ibn Hanbal. They don't call him Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Hanbal. They just call him Ahmad ibn Hanbal. The reason being is that his grandfather Hanbal was from the tribe of Shayban, and he was the governor of the city of Sarakhs in Khurasan. So that's the first thing. He had a high position, he was governor. The other thing, he was very active, and he took part in bringing down the Umayyad dynasty and bringing the Abbasids to power. And because of that, because of all this position of his grandfather and all the things that he was active in, people would refer him back to his grandfather, the more popular of the two. Meaning his father versus his grandfather. Grandfather was more popular and did more, so people refer to him as Ahmad ibn Hanbal. And his lineage does meet with that of the Prophet ﷺ, but further down the line. He had no brothers and he had no sisters. It was just him and his mother. So as we said, his father wasn't there, just him and his mother. And he was very close to his uncles. He had two uncles, Abdullah and Ishaq ibn Hanbal. And both of them were also very knowledgeable and scholars in their own right. His description is that he was tall and heavily tanned. But he was also very handsome. And later on, he would put light henna on his gray hairs. And he had a few black hairs on his beard. This is, of course, later on. And he would wear very coarse and rough clothing. And he would mostly sit cross-legged. And this is how they described him. Anytime you saw him sitting, he would be cross-legged, sitting on the floor, or most likely sitting cross-legged and reciting the Quran. And his mother, her name was Safiya bint Maymuna bint Abdul Malik ibn Shayban. And she had raised him, and she used to love him, and she used to love his company even after he grew up. They were always friends, they were always close. Even after he was a grown man, they were still very close. And he was very dutiful to her. And whatever she told him, he would follow that. And she wouldn't let him go too early to Fajr. And she would hold on to his clothing and tell him wait until the adhan. She didn't want him to go out in the dark. And there weren't street lamps and things like that. Just to show his obedience to his mother. One day, as a young man, he was with his friends. And there was the Dijla, which is kind of like the ditch or like a canal in the city. And his mother, the young men would always jump the canal to get to the other side. And his mother would always tell him, don't jump when it flows. In the seasons, it floods, it's full of water. Most of the time, it's empty. So she tells him, when it flows, don't jump. So one day he's with the young men and the shabab, and they all jump, and everyone thinking he's a hero jumps over the canal. And it was his turn, and he refused. So they said, Yalla, jump. He said, no. My mother tells me when it overflows, don't jump. So even though now he's a young man, and they might tell him, what kind of a man is this? His mother says, don't jump, she's afraid for you, you're not a man. But he was very dutiful to his mother. And she was, of course, the one who got him and pushed him into attaining knowledge and to learning language. And he began to memorize the Quran at an early age and learn the Arabic language, meaning here, learn it in the proper way, not just speak it. And she raised him upon piety and fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This was now, we're talking about the reign of Harun al-Rashid, the Khalifa Harun al-Rashid, who used to travel to Hajj and to battle. So he would then, when he is the Khalifa, he would settle in Baghdad, because the Khilafah at this point had shifted from Medina to the city of Baghdad. And whenever he's in jihad, he would be out of town. Whenever he's in Baghdad, the Khalifa, he's back in Baghdad. And during this time, the soldiers would go out with the Khalifa and to battle. The soldiers would write letters to their wives, and then their wives would want to write back, and they can't write, so they would ask the young men to write letters for their husbands for them. And now he was a young man at this point, but he would only write the things that were decent, and only things that were proper, nothing that's against the deen. Even though he's a young man, he would refuse to write anything like, a woman is like, maybe she's complaining against Allah or saying something that's not proper in the deen, that he would refuse to write it even though he was a young boy. And also he had his uncle. He used to write the news of Baghdad to the governor. And this news basically, it's almost like semi-spying, what this guy's up to, what's happening in the city and so on. So he would write the news of Baghdad to the governor, and then the letters stopped coming to the governor. So when he comes to Baghdad, he tells the uncle of Imam Ahmad, he says, where are the letters? Why did you stop sending them? And so he tells him, I used to send them with my brother's son Ahmad. And so they called him and they said, what happened to the letters? And he says, this is now, remember again, we're talking about a young boy here. He says, you want me to pass on this kind of news? He says, I have thrown it in the river. So he would, as a young boy, refused to pass on letters where it's spying and things of that nature. So he would take them and throw them in the river, and they would never receive. And then when he's asked by the governor and his uncle, he's not afraid to say, no, I'm not the kind who will pass on this kind of information, and I threw it in the river. So then, subhanallah, they said, Inna lillah wa inna ilayhi raji'un. We are to Allah and to Him we shall return. This is a young man, and yatawarra. Yatawarra yani, it's a level of taqwa. It's a really fine level of taqwa. So this is a young man and he has this level of taqwa. What about us then? And another man, this is again talking about the childhood of the Imam, or when he was a young boy. He said, verily I spend on my children and I bring them the mu'addibin. The mu'addibin, these were tutors you would bring, for your kids. But they would teach you a lot of things. Yani they would teach poetry, they would teach manners, and they would teach language. So they weren't just teachers, but they were also taught manners and refined manners, things like that. He says, I spend on my children, I bring them the mu'addibin, and I do not see them benefit. And I look at Ahmad ibn Hanbal, an orphaned young boy. And what he's saying is that this orphaned young boy, no one is spending on him that much, and no one is spending to bring him mu'addibin to his home, but yet look at him and look at my own children, whom I spend so much on. A man, his name was Ibrahim ibn Shammas. This man, he wasn't just any guy that we're quoting. He was known in the city as Al-Abid Al-Zahid, yani the devout worshipper, and a Zahid, someone who left the materialism of the world, so he was ascetic, yeah. So he says, كنت أرى أحمد بن حنبل يحيي الليل وهو غلام. I used to see Ahmad ibn Hanbal do the night prayer while he was a young boy. Even as a young boy, he would still do the night prayer. And another man, his name is Al-Haytham ibn Jamil. And again, this is not just some random person. This was, he was known as Al-Faqih, يعني the Faqih, Al-Hafiz. And he was from the people of Ilm al-Hadith. And he would say about Ahmad ibn Hanbal, إن عاش هذا الفتى, if this young man lives, فسيكون حجة على أهل زمانه. He is going to be كيف حجة نقول يعني like ها لا I forgot it. It's like a and then there's something like a benchmark, something like that for the people of his time. Or يعني it's almost like literally it's an argument, but what if, يعني, like a benchmark is closer. طيب. So we move on to what kind of life they lived. He's raised by his mother. His father wasn't there, and he lived in extreme poverty. His mother, she would earn a little bit of a living by sewing and selling the items and doing things for people like that. And Ahmad ibn Hanbal himself, rahimahullah, he would do something only an extremely poor person would do, known as laqtul hab, meaning he would go to the marketplace where the caravans would leave the city, or the caravans are coming, and as they put a huge sack of wheat or whatever kind of grain on top of the camel, a few would fall on the floor, right? Just a few might fall on the floor. So he would spend hours picking up grains from the floor, because they don't belong to anyone now. Travelers drop them and go, and as they're leaving out, they fall off the camel. And we're not talking about bunches, just little bits. And he would sit for hours picking up these grains one by one. And if they have enough, they would boil that and then they would eat it. So this is the extreme poverty that he lived in, and we're going to see this inshallah throughout his life, that he lived in this extreme type of poverty. As far as his studies, he was, of course, he studied for 40 years or so with many scholars and traveled seeking knowledge from many different places. But is one of the famous statements that he made, the scholars always quote it today. He would say, مع المحبرة إلى المقبرة. يعني the mahbara is like the ink pot, if you call it, where you dip your pen in to write. He would say, we're going to remain with the mahbara until we go to the maqbara, until we go to the grave. Constantly, we're going to be learning. And he studied with a lot of scholars, and we're going to look at some of them in detail. He studied with Hushaym ibn Bashir, and he studied with Abu Bakr ibn Ayyash. Abu Bakr ibn Ayyash is one of the more popular scholars. A lot of us are familiar with who he was. Very knowledgeable scholar, great scholar of Islam. And after Fajr, he would go and study with this Sheikh, Abu Bakr ibn Ayyash. And he would wake up before Fajr and go early. And this is when his mother would hold on to his clothes and tell him to wait until the adhan. But the majority of the benefit he got was from Hushaym ibn Bashir. He says, I memorized everything that I heard from Hushaym while Hushaym was alive. And Hushaym died in the year 184. So that means for about 20 years he remained with this scholar. Or more accurately, about 18 years he remained with Hushaym ibn Bashir. And after the death of Hushaym, he started to go out and he started to gather knowledge from different areas of the empire. As far as his time in Al-Basra as well, he studied with Yazeed ibn Harun. And Yazeed ibn Harun was a great scholar, but a very great scholar. We're going to come to what a major scholar he was and what he meant to the ummah at the time. But he also used to like to joke a lot. And Ahmad ibn Hanbal didn't like joking. He was very serious. But his teachers used to respect him so much that they wouldn't joke. Like Yazeed ibn Harun. Yazeed ibn Harun liked to joke, but he would refuse to joke if Ahmad ibn Hanbal was there, even though he was a young man, but because he respected Ahmad so much. So one day, Yazeed ibn Harun thinks Ahmad ibn Hanbal is not in the gathering, so he starts with his jokes. And Ahmad ibn Hanbal then says, yani to let him know that I'm here. So when he saw him, he smacked his forehead. And he said to the other students, why didn't you tell me that Ahmad ibn Hanbal was here so I would not joke? This is how much this scholar, this great scholar, you're going to see what a serious scholar he was. But this is how much he respected this young man. And this is how much he realized and recognized the position of the great Imam rahimahullah. So, and even Yazeed ibn Harun, one day he gives all, and this is something you're going to see constantly in his biography. He gives every one of his students 500 dinars. He was very wealthy. And all of them accepted it except for Ahmad ibn Hanbal. He used to not accept any kind of help, any kind of assistance, and barely even a loan would he accept from people. No help, not even from a friend. He wouldn't accept help and he would not accept gifts. Now, this is the amazing thing when you look at the lives of the scholars. You'll see that it's not one way to be a scholar. I guarantee you, if you ask the majority of people, they will imagine that the scholars always hated the Sultan, hated the Khalifa, were always poor, and thought the money of the Khalifa was haram. You even hear stories that have, for example, about Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, you'll hear stories that are exaggerated, and you can tell that they're made up, and they are indication of poor fiqh. There was a canal in the city of Al-Kufa, and the kitchen of the Khalifa would throw whatever leftover rice, bread, they would throw it into the canal. So they said, this is of course a false story, that Imam Abu Hanifa would not eat fish. Why? Because the Khalifa's kitchen would throw the leftover food in the canal and the fish would eat haram food. And this is poor fiqh. You don't have to delve into what the fish eat. But again, it was from the way of Imam Abu Hanifa to not take money from the Khalifa whatsoever. Why? He was a very wealthy businessman. He didn't need to. Imam Malik rahimahullah, he accepted the money of the Khalifa. Why? Because he felt that the scholars, the imams, they do a service in the ummah, just like the police force and these people. And so it is justified if the government spends on them from Baytul Mal. That's why this is what he would accept. Now you look at Imam Malik and Abu Hanifa rahimahumullah, they used to wear very fancy clothing. They used to always be dressed absolute best. You always imagine the sheikh, torn and holes in the thobe and so. No. Imam Malik had 500 hats, 500 shoes. He dressed very well, not because he wants to show off, but because he felt the ilm that he possessed put him at that level, and he had to dress according to the ilm. So same thing with Imam Abu Hanifa, his clothes were very nice. Imam Malik, he would feed his family meat every single day. And in that sense, of course, we're all Malikis, right? So, but then you go to scholars like Imam Ahmad, for example, and they were very, very poor. Imam al-Shafi'i also, very, very poor. And so it's not like there's just one way of how the scholars were, but it depends on their situations. So Imam Ahmad specifically didn't accept gifts and didn't accept help even from a friend when it came to his poverty. So, of course, at some point after the death of Hushaym, he decided to leave Iraq and he went to Mecca. And he also made Hajj 5 times during his lifetime. He says, and just to show you how poor he was, he says, I made Hajj 5 times, 3 of which were on foot, from Iraq to Mecca. 3 times on foot. And then he says, I've spent on all of them, all 5 journeys of Hajj. He spent on all of them 30 dirhams. Dirhams. A dinar is gold and it has 12 silver dirhams in it. He spent 30 dirhams in 3 trips to Hajj. That's how poor he was. So he'd just walk, stay hungry, keep walking. It just gives you an idea of how poor he was. just another story to show his poverty, and also to show again it shows his poverty and his way of not accepting help, his dignity, his ways also of not accepting help from people. The narrator is a man, his name is Ali ibn al-Jahm, and he was a poet. He says, we had a neighbor in Baghdad. One day this neighbor shows me a book, and he says, do you know whose handwriting this is? Because the books weren't like this, they weren't printed, they were handwritten. So I looked at it and I said, yes, this is the handwriting of Ahmad ibn Hanbal. So how did you come to have this book, or how did he come to write it for you? So then his neighbor tells him, he says, we were in Mecca studying with Sufyan ibn Uyayna. I think we all know this name. Fantastic scholar, Sufyan ibn Uyayna. He says, for some days we hadn't seen Ahmad ibn Hanbal. So we went to him. So he was renting a room in a house. We went to the room and we knocked. And he was wearing a khulqan, which is basically torn pieces of cloth. And we said, Ya Abu Abdullah, that was his kunya, his patronymic, Abu Abdullah. Ya Abu Abdullah, what is wrong? We haven't seen you for a number of days. So he says, my clothes were stolen. So he had only one garment, and he would wash it and hang it. He says, my clothes were stolen. So a man said, I have some dinars. If you like, take a loan from me. They know he doesn't like gifts. Take a loan from me, and if you like, take it as a gift. Yani whatever you want. So he refused both. He refused to take it as a loan and refused to take it as a gift. So this is the neighbor talking now. He says, so I thought, how can I help him? So I said to him, would you write for me, yani almost like the equivalent of printing. I need to copy a book. Would you write for me for a fee? And I took out a dinar, which is now a gold dinar, and said, take this as advance payment. And the Imam refused. He says, the Imam tells him, buy a piece of cloth and cut it in half. And this gives you an idea of the general poverty that existed, and even when you look at the companions of the Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, how poor they were, how the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam would tell the women not to hurry in raising their head from sujood, because the men in the front sometimes would just have a cloth around them, so they don't see the men uncovered, so they would delay raising their head from sujood. That's why when you study fiqh, you have the ruling of how the person prays if they don't have any clothes. And in our days, you think, why wouldn't he have any clothes? But back then, some people didn't have any clothes. You know very well the story of the companion who would leave early after Salah. And the Prophet ﷺ asked him, why he leaves so early? He said, because we have one garment and I rush back to give it to my wife so she can pray in it before the time goes out. So they were in extreme poverty. And of course, and a lot of people watch the movie The Message, and these guys are in thobes and stuff, and a lot of materials on them. And it wasn't like that. Remember when Ukaydir, Dawmat al-Jandal, when he was during Tabuk, when they captured him, they found some garments, the very nice garments. They sent it in advance to a Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and then the companions just kept touching it. It was just soft material. Like now we take velvet and stuff for granted. They just kept touching this material. They were so amazed at this material that was so soft, because a lot of the cloth was very coarse as well. So, but that poverty even until this point remained. So this is how a lot of people dressed. And you wouldn't expect this in Baghdad, everyone to be in a thobe. Some people would just be in a garment that's wrapped around their waist. And some people, the garment is around their waist and one over their shoulder. So the Imam tells him, buy a piece of cloth, cut it in half. And I'll use one as an izar, to wrap around the waist, and I'll throw another over my shoulders. And that was the shirt. Throw it over the shoulders. And bring me the rest of the money. He says, so I gave him the cloths and the rest of the money, and I brought him paper and ink, and he started to write the book for me. So this is his writing. He's telling him, this is how I got this book in my library with the handwriting of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. So this shows you the kind of poverty that he lived in. So amongst the people that he studied with was Sufyan ibn Uyayna in Mecca. Amongst his teachers in Mecca as well was Imam al-Shafi'i. And we're going to get to the relationship between Imam al-Shafi'i and Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal rahimahumullah. And so this is the narration now when by the great Imam Ishaq ibn Rahwiya. He says, Ahmad ibn Hanbal said to me, Ya Abu Yaqub, get up and I will show you a man there is none like him. And now notice, they were in the gathering of Sufyan ibn Uyayna, who is narrating a hadith he got from a Zuhri. Okay, so now we're looking at a fantastic scholar narrating from another fantastic scholar who studied, with Sahaba and so on. So now this is a fantastic chain of narration. Why would you leave this gathering? So he says now, and this narration is going to show you how Imam Ahmad was of the first people to discover the brilliance of a Shafi'i in Mecca. So Ishaq ibn Rahwayah here, he says, and this is a great scholar, you've probably heard his name many times. He says, Ahmad ibn Hanbal said to me, Ya Abu Yaqub, get up and I'll show you a man there is none like him. So we got up and he took me near Zamzam, the well of Zamzam. And he was a young man wearing white and he had a good appearance. Imam al-Shafi'i was very handsome. But he used to dress like the Bedouin. So he'd wear rough clothing, but he was a handsome man. And he said there was a young man, notice he was young, wearing white, who with a good appearance and a good mind. So we sat next to him. Okay? And Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal introduces him to Imam al-Shafi'i. He says, this is Ishaq ibn Rahwayah. And he says, Al-Handali, this is Ishaq ibn Rahwayah al-Handali. So he greeted him. Now who's speaking now? The great scholar Ishaq. He says, then knowledge exploded out of this young man that I was unable to keep up with and I was unable to memorize. And then when the meeting prolonged, he turned to Imam Ahmad and said, Ya Abu Abdullah, take us to the man that you said there is none like him. And we got up and you said there's none like him. So Imam Ahmad tells him, this is the man. So the Imam Ishaq, he tells him, Subhanallah, we left Sufyan ibn Uyayna as he was saying, Az-Zuhri narrated this and that. So I thought you're going to at least bring me to a man who's equal to Az-Zuhri. Right? And if you're listening to narrations from Az-Zuhri, at least if we're going to leave that, let's go to someone equal to Az-Zuhri. So you bring me to a young man, and he's surprised. Even though, notice, he's surprised because he was a young man, but he said the knowledge exploded out of him. I couldn't keep up with it. So Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal tells him, Ya Abu Yaqub, take from the man, for I have not seen his likes before. I've never seen anyone like him. So it shows you, the narration shows you that at a very early age, Imam Ahmad rahimahullah was of the first people to discover what a magnificent scholar Imam al-Shafi'i rahimahullah was. Before other people discovered it and before he became popular, because later on he becomes very popular. So they had a relationship where they both benefited from each other. So Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal was a muhaddith. A muhaddith is someone who understands the chains of narrations of a hadith, and he knows which narrator is trustworthy and which narrator is weak. The faqih is the one who is able to pull out the rulings and the ahkam from these hadith and obviously from the ayat as well. So he understands, he has fiqh, he has understanding. The muhaddith might only just know if the hadith is authentic or not, but not tell you the benefits and what we learn from the hadith. There was one famous story of a group of muhaddithin sitting in the masjid. And they would just look like, men in turbans and big beards, and you look like mashayikh, right? So a woman enters and she asks them a simple question about menses. So she asked the question, and all these mashayikh looking people can't answer the question. They stayed quiet. So they told her, this man, meaning here a Shafi'i, this was about a Shafi'i. They tell her, this man over here can answer your question. So she asked the question right in front of them. And Imam Shafi'i comes to them and she's asking the question, and the muhaddithin, they can hear. So he tells her, yes, the answer is, it's permissible, and the evidence is the hadith of this. When he says the hadith, all the muhaddithin jumped up, yes, and this is narrated from so-and-so, from so-and-so, from so-and-so. Because that's their job. They know who narrated it, and all the other chains and ways through which it's narrated, but they don't know what's the benefit, and the end, the نص الحديث اسمه ايش؟ المتن. يعني when they come to the matn, they don't know what's the ruling and what's the benefit they get out of it. So Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal was a muhaddith, but because of Imam Shafi'i, he became a faqih as well. Even though when he wrote his book Al-Musnad, he wrote it to gather a hadith. But later on, his students started to compile all his fiqh issues as well, and that's why he became known as a faqih and a muhaddith. So Imam al-Shafi'i was not a muhaddith, but he was a faqih. And so both of them, each one was stronger than the other in something. So Imam Ahmad learned the fiqh from Imam al-Shafi'i, but Imam al-Shafi'i would tell him that, "O Abu Abdullah, you are more knowledgeable with the authority of narrations than me. So if the hadith is authentic, then inform me so that I may use it." So both of them now recognize the strength of the other. So now Ahmad ibn Hanbal is learning fiqh as well as hadith. And then after that he also moves to Yemen and he studies with Abdul Razzaq. Back then when he said Abdul Razzaq, they didn't ask who. It was known. Abdul Razzaq as-San'ani, from San'an in Yemen. And we're going to come to him inshaAllah. So okay. He says he also went to other great scholars. One of them, his name was Ibrahim ibn Mu'aqil ibn Munabbih as-San'ani. He says, I went to him and he was usr, he was strict and difficult, just not easy to deal with. Look at this, and it shows you determination. He says, I stood at his door for a day or maybe two, just to get permission to study with him. And imagine what happens now. Imagine the ISC hires some imam and he's like that. I think his halaqah will be very empty. It'll just be him and some crickets, and Radwan, only because he had to open the microphones for him. But the dedication of the imam here, he stood at his door for a day or two, just hoping to get permission. He says, until I got to him, what happened? He studied with him for a month. He gave me 2 hadith. For a day or two, he stood outside his door. He says, he gave me 2 hadith. That's it. Yalla, get lost. So then, and he was saying that the journey to Sana'a was a very difficult journey, but he took a lot of hadith, especially from Abdul Razzaq. And he noticed that Abdul Razzaq, and each scholar had a specific characteristic that later on, when the Imam starts to teach at age 40, you will see him, you'll see exactly what characteristic he got from which scholar. And that's why we're mentioning it. Abdul Razzaq, this great scholar, rahimahullah, he said that he noticed this scholar, despite his unbelievable memorization and fantastic knowledge, he would always yuhaddith, meaning he would narrate the hadith from a book. Not that his memory isn't enough, but just shows you how careful and how intricate and detailed he was. Then this is the thing that when people today attack the sunnah, it's all with these hadith, we don't know how they were collected. And these people, they don't know what they're talking about. They never, for 2 minutes, listen to how hadith were gathered. They tell you that in the gatherings of the muhaddithin, they even took attendance. Yani so-and-so was here, so-and-so was absent. Why? So that later on, no one just stands and says, Haddathana Zuhri, like he has a chain of narration to a Zuhri. Even attendance, they took it. It was very, very detailed and intricate. Abdul Razzaq, rahimahullah, despite his fantastic knowledge, he's still using a book just to be extra careful. So Imam Ahmad learned that from him, and later on he would give the hadith from a book as well, even though it was in his mind, no mistakes about it. But then at the end of the journey from Yemen, he goes back to Mecca, not to Baghdad. And that's where he stayed with Imam Sufyan al-Thawri. No, sorry. Sufyan al-Thawri had passed away, and Imam al-Shafi'i had gone to Egypt. This is now, he's returned back to Mecca. And but he still remained there seeking knowledge. So he had a long journey of gaining knowledge, but the top 5 scholars that he benefited from were Hushaym ibn Bashir, and he studied with him at an early age. And he was 4.5 years old when he began to study with Hushaym ibn Bashir, and he narrates from him 3,000 narrations. Then there was Yazeed ibn Harun, that's the one we said that likes to joke, and he was the Imam of Wasit. Then there was Ismail ibn Ulayya. Ulayya is a woman's name, as you can see, but we're going to explain why he's called Ibn Ulayya. And the 4th was Sufyan ibn Uyayna, the great scholar Sufyan ibn Uyayna, and the 5th was Abdul Razzaq as-San'ani that he stayed with for 2 years. So now, the idea is that we're going to study the biography of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, rahimahullah, and inshallah by the end of Ramadan we'll be done with it, and we're going to cover the fitna of the creation of the Quran in detail. But there's some great scholars and some great names that we may never get another chance to sit and talk about or to mention. And so let's start with Hushaym ibn Bashir, because he was for 18 years the teacher of our Imam. So let's see who he was and what he was like. Hushaym ibn Bashir, rahimahullah, he was a young man, and he was from a kind of poor family, and so his father would keep asking him to come and work and help him at his work. But Hushaym, he used to go to the judge, the qadi, the judge of the city. He had a halaqah there, and he wanted as a young man to go and learn. It's kind of like unlike today. Kids hate school, they hate learning, you gotta force them to do it. And here he would leave work and escape helping his dad to go to the judge and to learn from the halaqah of the judge. So one day Hushaym became sick, and he became sick for a long time. Now you got to realize the judge, his halaqah, who's in it? Big shots only. Judge, other judges and justices and big shots, governors, people in high ranking officials in government. So this young boy, who would notice him? He was sick for a long time. So the judge said, where is that young man that used to learn with us? The judge paid attention to him because he was intelligent. So they told him he's sick. So he said, let's go and visit him. So now you don't expect, his father is this poor man, and he hears a knock at the door, and he was a cook, by the way. Okay, he was a cook. He hears a knock at the door. When he opens, the judge and his big shot friends, they go to visit Hushaym and his home. His father's at work. He's a cook. Somebody tells him, listen, the judge and all the important people are at your house. So he runs to his house, and he sees that the judge came just to visit his son. So when the judge and everybody else leaves, he tells them, "O son, I used to prevent you from seeking hadith, but not anymore. The judge now comes to my home. I'm just a simple cook, and now the judge of the city is coming to my home. He says, I had never dreamt that the judge would come to visit my home." And from that day, the father of Hushaym would support him in seeking knowledge. He said, this is Hushaym now, he said, because now we're talking about his biography, he said, I would memorize 100 hadith in one class, in one sitting. Now what does that mean, memorize 100 hadith? The way we narrate hadith now, nice in English, and we paraphrase and we say, one of the companions narrated the Prophet ﷺ said something to the effect of this, right? When he's saying that, he's not just memorizing the matn. The matn is what's spoken, because we go from so-and-so narrated from so-and-so, then it gets to the Nabi ﷺ said, this is called the matn. He's not saying I'm memorizing 100 mutun, he's memorizing 100 hadith with the narration, each one with a different chain, different people. In one gathering, he would memorize 100 hadith. He says, if I were asked about them 10 months later, I would still remember them. Not just temporary, but for the long term. So he would travel and he would learn from the tabi'een and from tabi'it tabi'een. And he attained vast knowledge. He studied with Imam Malik. So now you can link all four Imams to each other through teachers and students. So he studied with Imam Malik, he studied with Sufyan al-Thawri, he studied with Shu'bah ibn al-Hajjaj, even though he was older than Shu'bah ibn al-Hajjaj, but he still sat and studied with him. So that was Hushaym ibn Bashir, the teacher of the Imam that he started with in the beginning and stayed with for about 18 to 20 years. The second was Yazeed ibn Harun, the one we said that likes to joke. Yazeed ibn Harun was known for his knowledge and his lengthy salah. And not just night, but also during the day, he would stand in long salah, always praying nawafil during the day. And of course, it's permissible to do that. Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, later on you'll see he do the same thing, and that's what he got from Yazeed ibn Harun, that he would pray for many hours during the day and at night as well. So this was the great taqwa of this scholar Yazeed ibn Harun. And Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, he would look for the scholar that was also a devout worshipper and a zahid, not after the dunya, and a devout worshipper. These was his criterion when he would look for a sheikh to study with. And Yazeed ibn Harun, he said, I memorized 25,000 chains of narrations, different chains. And I'm not boasting. And he says, and I memorized 2,000 ahadith from the people of Sham, of which I do not hesitate. What does that mean? It means that these ahadith, they're so authentic, the narrators are so authentic, I don't hesitate at all in narrating these ahadith. And then he would say, لا أقامني الله إن كنت لا أقوم بحديثي. May Allah, meaning may Allah not let me remain alive if I do not act upon the ahadith. And this is something we see again with Imam Ahmad later on, when he writes the Musnad, which had about 40,000 ahadith. He said, I never wrote down a hadith except that I acted upon it. Never wrote a hadith except that he acted upon it. Even when he heard that the Prophet ﷺ, he got cupped, and he gave Abu Tayba, the Hajjam, the cupper, he gave him a dinar. He says, I got cupped and I gave the Hajjam a dinar. To that extent. So where he get that from, you can start to see now where he's getting these things from. The Salah, using the book from San'ani, and here from Yazeed ibn Harun, that acting upon what he learns. Now, again, we're talking now about Yazeed ibn Harun, and I promised you earlier that we're going to talk about what a major scholar and what he meant to the ummah at that time. This will show you. He was a man that had hayba. His hayba is when someone has a commanding presence, right? And there's some people, you see them, you can fool around in front of them. Some people, if they're in the room, you don't fool around. You sit properly because they have this commanding presence. So Yazeed ibn Harun, even though he liked to joke, he had hayba. And Al-Ma'mun, the Khalifa Al-Ma'mun, later on, he followed the Mu'tazila in the creation of the Quran. They said that the Quran is created. Even though he had this belief, he was afraid because of Yazeed ibn Harun, the Khalifa of the entire Ummah, and he wanted to force the Ummah upon this belief, but he never announced his belief until the death of Yazeed ibn Harun. He was afraid of Yazeed ibn Harun. He says at one time, this is now we're talking about Al-Ma'mun. He says, had it not been for Yazeed ibn Harun, I would have announced and declared the creation of the Quran. So then one of the people in the gathering, he tells him, Ya Amir al-Mumineen, and who is Yazeed so that he should be feared? You're the Khalifa, this is just a scholar. What's the problem? So the Khalifa, Al-Ma'mun, he tells him, woe to you. I do not fear him, but he has a sultan, meaning he has a following, he has that kind of power. But I fear that if I announce my position regarding the creation of the Quran, he would respond to me and refuse my position and announce his, and a fitna will occur. So what does that tell you? It tells you he had so much of a following that if the Khalifa said yes and he said no, people would be divided and split, and there would be a fitna in the ummah. This was Yazeed ibn Harun rahimahullah. So the man, this guy from the Khalifa's court, he thinks he's smart. He says, I'm going to go test him for you. And the Khalifa tells him, go ahead, go test him. So the man goes to Wasit, to Yazeed ibn Harun, to the Masjid in the city of Wasit. And he says, Ya Abu Khalid, this was the patronymic of Yazeed ibn Harun. O father of Khalid, Ya Abu Khalid, Amir al-Mumineen gives you his salams. And he says to you that I wanted to announce that the Quran is created. So he's testing him to see what he's going to respond with. So Yazeed ibn Harun tells him, you have lied against Amir al-Mu'mineen. Amir al-Mu'mineen would never force people upon that which they do not know. Meaning what? They don't, like a new bid'ah, like a bid'ah. So this is something people don't know. Amir al-Mu'mineen would never force people upon that which they do not know and what no one has said before. So he kind of closed the door. So the man returns and to Baghdad, to the Khalifa, and he tells him, to the Ma'mun, he tells the Ma'mun that what he said to him. Taban, the Khalifa is smarter than this guy. He knows that Amir al-Mu'mineen believed him. So the guy thinks, oh, he doesn't believe me. He's saying, Amir al-Mu'mineen, you lied against him. He would never do something like that. And he didn't believe what I'm telling him. But Amir al-Mu'mineen tells him, woe to you. He fooled you. He was saying that, he's sending me an indirect message. So you wouldn't dare do that. That's what he's really telling me. You see? So he was afraid of Yazeed ibn Harun. And once Yazeed ibn Harun died in the year 206, then the fitna started. And just to give you an idea, Imam al-Shafi'i died 204. So 206, the Yazeed ibn Harun dies, and the fitna started, and its fire was blazed, and the fuel of this fire was, unfortunately, the scholars of the Ummah. And of course, the man who stood mostly in the way of the fitna was Ahmad ibn Hanbal, the student of Yazeed ibn Harun. So not only was he a scholar, but he used to be of those who would forbid what is evil, even if it meant standing against the Khalifa himself. So now we discussed 2 of the 5 scholars that had the most influence on the Imam. The first was Hushaym ibn Bashir. The second was Yazeed ibn Harun. The third is Ismail ibn Ulayya. And he has a strange name because Ibn Ulayya is a woman. His name actually was Ismail, the son of Ibrahim ibn Muqassim. But this man Ibrahim ibn Muqassim married a woman. Her name was Ulayya. And she gave him a boy. And they named him after his mother. Why? Because again, she was such an intellectual and such a noble, and she raised him in the best way. And so, and this sometimes happens even in our communities. If someone, I know it's rare, but someone has a wife that's so, let's say, knowledgeable or more active than him, you would refer to him as so-and-so, the husband of so-and-so. And not her, the wife of so-and-so. The opposite. We had a guy like that in Virginia. We referred to him, the husband of Fulana, because she was an active da'i and everything like that. So she was such an intellectual and a knowledgeable woman and a noble woman that they referred him to his mother. Ahmad ibn Hanbal used to say, I missed Malik. What does that mean? I missed Imam Malik. I wasn't alive to be there at the time to benefit from Imam Malik. So Allah replaced him for me with Sufyan ibn Uyayna. And I missed Hammad ibn Ziyad or ibn Zayd. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala replaced him for me with Ismail ibn Ulayya. And or here he said Ismail ibn Ibrahim. And Ibrahim or Ismail ibn Ulayya, he was from the greatest scholars of the city of Al-Basra. And his mother used to love knowledge, and she would send him to the best scholars. And so, but he didn't like that name. And he says, whoever calls me the son of Ulayya, he has اغتابني, he has backbited me. And Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal used to also prevent people from calling him that. But it was the popular name. Everybody would say Ibn Ulayya. And Imam Ahmad would stop them and say, don't call him that. It became the popular name, but of course after he died, it wasn't ghiba anymore, and he became known as Ismail ibn Ulayya. But one of the things you start to see is that there is always a great woman behind great scholars. Always. Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, his mother edged him onto knowledge. Imam al-Shafi'i, the same thing. His mother would send him out to learn. Imam Malik wanted to become a singer. His mother makes him into a young scholar. Ibn al-Qayyim and others. Ibn al-Qayyim had a sister who was really into knowledge, and because his mother had passed away, his sister got him into knowledge. Ismail ibn Ulayya here as well, his mother. So many times you'll see mothers and their role with the scholars. Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, again Al-Khatib, now we're taking quotes, but we're not taking quotes from nobodies. Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, again the great muhaddith and a great scholar, and he says, we're talking still about the biography of Ismail ibn Ulayya. We're not talking about Ahmad ibn Hanbal right now. So, or Ismail ibn Ibrahim, is that what you said? Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, this great scholar, this great muhaddith, he says the people of memorization, al-Huffaz from here, from the city of Al-Basra, met with those of the people of Al-Kufa. So they're going to have a test now, a kind of a competition, and see which city has the better memorization. So the people of Al-Kufa said to the people of Al-Basra, move aside Ibrahim ibn Ulayya and bring anybody else you want. They show you the place of Ismail ibn Ulayya, rahimahullah. Abu Dawood, our Abu Dawood, of Imam Abu Dawood, he said there is none of the muhaddithin except that he has erred. He's made a mistake, except Ismail ibn Ulayya. And Bishr, Bishr ibn al-Mufaddal. This is another person, but he's mentioning Ismail ibn Ulayya, showing you the excellence of this muhaddith. And Ismail ibn Ulayya was very, very serious, and he never laughed nor he ever joked, and he had this hayba, this commanding presence. One of the students says, I stayed with him for 20 years and I never saw him laugh. So you might ask yourself, طيب يا أخي, this is not from the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ smiled, right? He didn't say he never smiled. He said he never laughed. He was very serious. Later on, when Imam Ahmad starts to teach, you'll see that he was also very serious. So we can assume he got that seriousness when it comes to teaching a hadith from Ismail ibn Ulayya rahimahullah. The fourth, so now we discussed Hushaym ibn Bashir, Yazeed ibn Harun, Ismail ibn Ulayya, and the fourth, Sufyan ibn Uyayna. You don't have to struggle to memorize this name. The famous scholar Sufyan ibn Uyayna was known. And he was the Imam of Hadith. He lived in Al-Kufa. And he was 10 years younger than Sufyan al-Thawri. And he became popular to the point that he became the main lecturer when he made hijrah to Mecca. He became the main lecturer at Al-Haram in Mecca. And he was named Muhaddith al-Haram al-Mekki, يعني the Muhaddith of the Haram in Mecca. طيب, and his name was Sufyan ibn Uyayna ibn Abi Imran. Al-Shafi'i, Imam al-Shafi'i rahimahullah says about him, he says, had it not been for Malik and Sufyan, the knowledge of Hijaz would have disappeared. Because again, Sufyan ibn Uyayna, we said, was in Mecca. And Imam Malik was in was in Medina. But it's still in Hijaz, right? So he's saying, had it not been for these two, then the knowledge of Hijaz would have disappeared. And he used to also say that Malik and Sufyan ibn Uyayna were comparable to each other. And when you read the biography of Imam Malik, when you say someone is comparable to Imam Malik, khalas, that means top level scholar. And talking about Sufyan ibn Uyayna, his father took him to Hajj when he was at the age of 6, and he made Hajj a total of 27 times. And he had 9 sons, 4 of which were muhaddithin themselves, the narrators of ahadith. And he met more than 80 of the tabi'een, the successors of the Prophet ﷺ. But the definition of a companion is someone who met the Prophet ﷺ while they were Muslim, right? And remained Muslim until, not like Abu Jahl. Abu Jahl is not a companion, not a Sahabi. So he wasn't Muslim. And then the definition similarly of a tabi'i is someone who met a Sahabi while he was Muslim and upon Islamic proper aqidah or proper belief. And for example, the Khawarij, you don't count them as tabi'een and things like that. But so and again, a tabi'in or tabi'in is someone who met one of the tabi'een and while he was Muslim and upon correct belief and remained upon that. So when we say he met 80 of the tabi'een, then it would make him one of the tabi'in. And it was, some scholars have said that it's a condition that you narrate from the companion to be a tabi'i, or you narrate from a tabi'i to be a tabi'i. But that's not, the majority of scholars don't actually use that stipulation. They don't agree with that. So then, for that reason, Sufyan ibn Uyayna used to say, because he met 80 of the successors, he would say, nothing is between me and the companions of the Prophet ﷺ except a veil. And what does it mean? And just something really thin and small is between me and the companions of the Prophet ﷺ. I met 80 of the people who met them and studied with them. Right? So, imagine you study with Nafi', for example. He was the freed servant of Abdullah ibn Umar. He was with him for so many years. It's almost like being right there with Ibn Umar radiallahu anhuma. So he had a huge halaqah near the Kaaba, and on top of that is also described that he had also a very beautiful voice. And Imam Ahmad said, I've never seen anyone more knowledgeable in the Sunnah than Ibn Uyayna. This is again to show his position. From his wisdoms, he was also a very wise man and a wise scholar. He would say, the scholar is not the one who knows the good and the evil. The scholar is the one who knows the good and follows it, and knows the evil and avoids it. Allah, it's so true. Huh? It's not just about knowing a hadith and having information, but it's the one who knows the good and he follows it. And how many have we seen of people who have knowledge, but they break and they follow whatever the sultan says, whatever the government says, whatever the current is, So he's saying is the one who knows the good and follows it, and knows the evil and avoids it. And so again, it links you to action again, talking about knowledge and action. He's saying that the beginning of knowledge is insat, listening, and memorization, then acting upon it, then disbursement. You hear it, memorize it, act upon it, and then you spread it to people. So he was a great scholar and also a great worshipper of Allah Azza wa Jal, and he was a zahid, and he had a great madhab. A lot of people think the four madhahib were the only, these were the only great imams, or the only great madhahib, that's why we have them. But there were actually many great madhahib, and he had a great madhab, but why didn't his madhab survive until today? That's it, huh? Okay. Why didn't his madhab survive? Because he didn't have students. And students are what carry on the madhab. The madhab of Abu Hanifa was carried on by his students, Imam Malik, and so on and so forth. So he didn't have enough students to carry on and build upon his madhab, and that's why. And the fifth scholar that Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal benefited from greatly was Abdul Razzaq ibn Humam ibn Nafi' ibn Humayri al-San'ani. Imam al-Dhahabi says about him, he was a storage of knowledge, and people would travel to him from all around the world. If they said Abdul Razzaq, nobody said which Abdul Razzaq. It was known. You said Abdul Razzaq, khalas, it was known. They're talking about al-San'ani. And he was the Imam of Yemen, and he came from a family of scholars. His father and his uncle, all of them were scholars, and yet he learned from them, and he still traveled around the world learning. And later on, someone commented about about Abdul Razzaq al-San'ani. He said, فَوَاللَّهِ لَقَدْ أَتْعَبَ الْإِبِلِ. And he says, Wallahi, he caused a lot of distress and fatigue for the camels. Why? Because people would travel to him on camelback. So he's the cause of a lot of camels being tired. And the people of Hadith and also another quote saying, the people of Hadith have not traveled to see someone after the Prophet ﷺ as much as they have to Abdul Razzaq al-San'ani. And now, okay, we don't hear too much about al-San'ani, but a lot of people have read about him and they know who he was, and you study in-depth fiqh and hadith, you always hear the name of al-San'ani. But back then, they used to say people of hadith never traveled as much to one person after Nabi ﷺ as they have traveled to Abdul Razzaq al-San'ani. So these were the top 5 scholars that Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal rahimahullah studied with. And even though Imam Ibn al-Jawzi mentions 414 shuyukh that the Shaykh studied with, amongst them was also a woman, and her name was Umar bint al-Hasan ibn Zayd al-Thaqafi. So there was also a woman scholar amongst his teachers. And we said al-Shafi'i was his fiqh teacher, and he was also of the strongest of his teachers. And Imam Ahmad says, I have not gone to a Shafi'i except that I found, someone says, I have not gone to a Shafi'i except that I found Ahmad ibn Hanbal sitting with him, and he was in his company more than we were. So Ahmad ibn Hanbal was constantly with the Shafi'i. And Ahmad ibn Hanbal says, if I'm asked about an issue about which I have no hadith, what do? I respond with the saying of a Shafi'i on that issue. This is the trust he had in a Shafi'i and in the knowledge of a Shafi'i. There are 2 sons of Imam Ahmad, Salih and Abdullah. We're going to come to them. But Imam Ahmad reached such a high degree in knowledge that someone asked his son. He says, your father memorized 1,000 hadith. What's 1,000? 1,000,000. He says, yes. He says, and how do you know? He's asking his son. He says, ذَاكَرْتُهُ. I sat with him and he said them to me. We know that hadith of Prophet ﷺ, they're not 1,000,000, not even close to that. But when you can have one hadith through many different narrations, right? Plus, when you memorize the statements of Abdullah ibn Umar or Abdullah ibn Abbas, it counts. They're counting all of that as 1,000,000 of these statements of scholars and tabi'een and sahaba and different narrations of the Prophet ﷺ. Harmala is one of the students of Imam al-Shafi'i. He says, I heard the Shafi'i say, I left Baghdad and I did not leave behind me any man better, nor more knowledgeable, nor afqah, nor atqa, than Ahmad ibn Hanbal. So he says, خرجت من بغداد فما خلفت بها رجل أو رجلا أفضل ولا أعلم ولا أتقى ولا أفقه من Ahmad ibn Hanbal. But like I said, the Imam did not sit and teach until he reached the age of 40. And they asked him why. And he had so much knowledge at such an early age, but he did not rush to teach until the age of 40. And they asked him why. He said the Prophet ﷺ was sent when he was 40 years old. And he doesn't have to abide by that, but this is to the degree to which he wanted to follow the Nabi ﷺ. He says the Prophet ﷺ didn't teach until he was 40. He wasn't sent until he was 40. So I'm going to start teaching when I'm 40. He could have started when he was in his 20s, but he waited that long. And people were waiting for him, eagerly, anxiously waiting for him to start teaching. And when he started teaching in Baghdad at the Grand Mosque there, the people were so impressed. And his chains of narrations were so short, because he studied from people, and so his chains weren't like so-and-so told us from so-and-so, from so. It was just from so-and-so, from so-and-so, from so-and-so, and Nabi ﷺ said this. Because he studied with scholars that studied with so many tabi'een who heard from the companions, who heard from the Prophet ﷺ. And in these gatherings there would be scholars, not just students of knowledge, great scholars would be sitting, and they would be in total silence. And there would be 5,000 students writing what he was saying. So the question is, how did 5,000 students hear what he was saying? First of all, there was total silence, but also, the way of microphones back then was that there were people who would stand from a distance where they could hear, within earshot of the Imam, and he would speak, and then they would repeat what he was saying, and then there might be people at another distance, and they would repeat, and so a large gathering of people could hear. That's why sometimes you would hear that when Imam Bukhari went to the city, 10,000 people came out to hear his dars. So how did they listen? How did they know microphones? People would repeat like that. But there would be designated people who were students of knowledge, very accurate, and they would say out loud to the people what he was saying. So then, because the size of his halaqah, there wasn't a way for people to ask questions, so he would have another halaqah for his students, the students of knowledge, to ask specific questions. And in this halaqah, even his uncles, his sons, Salih and Abdullah, would be in his gathering. And they said that in his gathering he would equate the poor with the rich. He was very in touch with the poor. Al-Marudhi, he said, I've never seen the poor more honored than in the gatherings of Abu Abdullah, the gatherings of Ahmad ibn Hanbal. And people from Al-Andalus, from Spain, from Khurasan, and around the world would come to Imam Ahmad. Abu Asim was a very well-known faqih at the time, major faqih, Abu Asim. He says, Imam Ahmad came, so we opened up a path for him. And he started to ask him questions. Every time he asked Ahmad ibn Hanbal, and the full story is that he asked Ahmad ibn Hanbal, when he entered, Abu Asim told him to come to the front. Imam Ahmad said, I don't like to step over the necks of the believers, which is prohibited. So he asked people to open a path for him. And they opened the path for him, and he came. So Abu Asim, this great faqih, would ask him a question. He would respond to every question with a hadith. So in the end, this great faqih said, he is from the creatures of the sea. He's not a human being, this man. Everything I ask him, he answers with a hadith. طيب, we'll end, yeah? طيب, how about this then? Because actually what we're doing is we're starting with next week, we're starting straight with the fitna, inshallah. But very quickly, I'm just going to talk quickly about his sons, okay? So he got married at the age of 40 as well. Why did he get married late? Because he didn't want to burden his wife with the trips and in the poverty and seeking knowledge from one place to another. So he got married to a woman. Her name was Al-Abbas bint al-Fadl. He stayed with her for 30 years. He got his son Salih, which was a scholar and one of his students. Then she died after 30 years. He said, I never had one quarrel with her for 40 years. So go home and share that with the family. Then after she died, he married Rayhana, and he got from her his son Abdullah. Even though his older son is Salih, he's not known as Abu Salih. Imam Ahmad is known as Abu Abdullah because only it was his kunya before marriage. He was also one of the imams of the madhab. His son Abdullah was one of the imams of his madhab. And then he later on had a slave girl. His name was Husn, and from her he got Zainab, 2 twins, Al-Hasan and Al-Hussein, and Muhammad and Sa'id. And so total then he had 6 boys, and 2 of which were muhaddithin. Sa'id became the judge of the city of Al-Kufa. And and from his zuhud and his worship, that he would fast even when he was being whipped later on in the heat, and he's being whipped really hard, he would be fasting. And his following of the sunnah is that he would not write a hadith except that he would act upon it. And even when he was in hiding for a time, he remained hiding in a trusted friend's house for 3 days. Then after 3 days he said, I have to leave. He said, Ya akhi, this is safe, stay here. If you go somewhere else, they'll report you to the government, they'll capture you. He says, find me a place to stay, then I'll tell you something you will benefit from. So then, subhanAllah. So then what happens, he finds him a safe place, and he leaves this home of his trusted and good friend to go to a new place. And he tells him, the reason I stayed with you only for 3 days is that the Prophet ﷺ stayed in Ghar Thawr, the cave of Thawr, for 3 days. But look what he said. He doesn't have to follow the sunnah, but look what he said. He said, does it make sense that we follow the sunnah at times of ease and leave it at times of hardship? So even at the time of hardship, he insisted. Rahimallah al-Imam, Jazakumullah khairan for your attentive listening. And inshallah, we begin next week immediately with the fitna of the creation of the Quran. Sallallahu wa barak ala Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Jazakumullah khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.